Hello everyone, Leon here, hijacking the beginning of this episode. On behalf of myself, Danny, Justin and Amal, we just wanted to apologise for how long it's taken to get this episode out. It's been completely crazy here at the Web Platform Podcast over the last few weeks, where Danny, Justin and Amal have been swamped with Google I/O related stuff, and I've had to take a few weeks off to get married. So we're back in action now, we've got some great episodes coming for you, so stay tuned, and I hope you enjoy this episode.
Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Web Platform Podcast, episode number 160. Today we're talking about Ng-Conf. Get a little Angular on. We are your hosts this week, Justin Ribeiro and Danny Blue. Danny, how's it going?
It's going pretty good, Justin. And there's a lot of really cool stuff at Ng-Conf. I'm very excited.
It was an exciting conference. I myself did not get a chance to go, but I saw, I was feeling the FOMA, watching the tweets as they scrolled through my feed as people talking about very interesting things. And we've got an interesting guest to talk about these things about that happened at Ng-Conf. But before we get to that, we're actually going to throw it over to Danny this week, who's going to do This Week in the Web in 2 minutes or less, because Leon has the week off. Danny?
Thank you very much. A few interesting tidbits in the web this week. NGRX6 has been announced, so anybody that is interested in Angular and RxJs should definitely take a look at that. Anybody that is familiar with Smooshgate has probably seen that it has seemingly been resolved by renaming flatten to flat. If you are not familiar with what Smooshgate is, I highly recommend you look it up. It's a very interesting, seemingly very silly and arbitrary story, but actually very interesting and shows how much work goes into decisions for the web. TypeScript 2.9 RC has been released. There's a blog post over on Microsoft.com talking about some of the features that are in the new RC, so take a look at that if you are interested in TypeScript. A new Vue CLI has been released, or rather a new version of the Vue CLI, even published under a slightly different package name, which is supposed to help simplify development even further. So if you are in the Vue community, if you're just interested in Vue, I would definitely take a look there. And the most exciting bit of news in This Week in Web is the fact that our very own Leon got married. So harass him on Twitter. We know us here at the Web Platform Podcast are very, very happy for him.
Fantastic. Thanks, Danny, for that. Some interesting things going on the platform this week. A lot of pull requests coming. With I/O coming up, I can imagine there will be even more pull requests in Chrome soon. But we're not talking about Chrome today. No, we're not talking about Firefox. No, today we're talking about Ng-Conf, all things Angular, and just what happened and all the interesting things. This week's guest, Jeff Whelpley. Jeff, welcome so much to the show. Thanks for joining us.
How's it going, guys?
So for folks out there who don't know you, how about a little bit of an introduction, Jeff?
Sure. I'm the CTO and co-founder of a company called Swish, and I'm a Google developer expert, which means I do a lot of stuff within the Google community, community of developers that use different Google products, especially focused on Angular.
Now, Angular's been around for a long time. We've talked about Angular on the show before, and how did you get started in Angular? What was your sort of introductory into it?
Yeah, so I actually started right from the beginning. In fact, it was a timing thing more than anything else, because when I left Wells Fargo, I was working at a big, humongous company with tons of people, and I sort of ventured out to start my own series of companies. And at that time, I knew I wanted to build a certain type of app that needed, a very strong, rich client JavaScript framework. But this was 6 years ago, and to be honest, there wasn't much back then besides Backbone and a couple other things. But Angular had just come out, and it was way better than Backbone. Ember was also there, but really not a lot of other competitors at that time. So I started using it right off the bat with Get Human, and it sort of just went from there. I've just been using it ever since.
And it's changed a lot, which I suppose is a good segue into, hey, Ng-Conf happened. I heard it was exciting.
Oh yeah, every year Ng-Conf gets better. It is consistently one of the best conferences I ever go to, but this year in particular, the organizing committee and everyone involved just went all out, and it was amazing.
And Ng-Conf is a community run event, right? Like it's not like an official. The Angular team doesn't put this on. It's a community event.
That's right. There's a team in Salt Lake City which it's kind of funny. I don't know where you guys are from, but I'm in Boston and East Coast, and I lived in California for a while. And so I think coastally. I think, East Coast, West Coast in terms of technical hubs. But I wouldn't think in the middle of the country in Salt Lake is such a big technical hub, but they have a huge JavaScript community there that's been really strong for a while now. And a big part of that community when Angular was just first starting out formed Ng-Conf 5 years ago. And they have just been great, very well connected in the community. Many of them have been Google developer experts as well. And they are really well connected and usually are able to get a lot of team members from the Angular core team to come to this conference.
Yeah, which is awesome, which is one of the reasons that so much really cool information, like it actually feels like a place where announcements for Angular would actually happen. Like you could feel the some of the ramp up. Like I know quite a few people were a little bit bummed that Angular 6 missed being released at Ng-Conf or right before Ng-Conf. But with that, let's start talking about what actually happened at Ng-Conf, starting with the keynote. So one of the big things that was talked about was obviously kind of new things that are coming in Angular 6. And one of the key features, I guess really one of the only big API changes that a lot of folks might see or might make use of is something called tree shakeable providers. Do you want to speak a little bit to what tree shakeable providers are?
Yeah, and to be clear, I think with a lot of the changes that are coming down the line now, the great thing is that most of them are not major breaking changes, and the ones that are somewhat require an API change, they're doing this, what I think is a great approach where Angular has the CLI that drives a lot of the management of an Angular app. It kind of sits above Webpack and builds your app and manages, scaffolding and that type of thing. And part of these updates too are ng update, which would allow you to transition your app for those minor API changes. In many cases, would make them automatically as part of the update process through the CLI. So just to be clear on that, as opposed to the Angular JS 1.x to 2.0, which was a huge change in breaking everything, we really don't have that much anymore. But for the tree shakeable providers and some of the other stuff they're doing with the rendering engine, it's really to reduce the size overall of your end package, make your app faster to load. And so, with Webpack, which I know a lot of people who build JavaScript front-end apps end up using for packaging their application, there are limitations into what can be tree shaken, or in other words, JavaScript that's not being referenced, not being included in that final package to make the bundle size smaller. And there's some limitations, various ones, like, for example, if something is part of a class, it's very hard to detect that a part of that class is not being used while another part is. And so a lot of the work, both within Angular, but then also within some of the underlying libraries like RxJs, is to modify the internals so that when a person naturally imports just one thing out of a library, that one thing is the only piece of code that will actually end up in the final bundle. And to that end, that wasn't the case with just because of some of the underlying internals of Angular. It wasn't doing that very efficiently, or it's not in the kind of pre-6 version. But now it will be so. I forget what the percentage they say that it's going down, but it will be pretty significant.
Yeah, absolutely. The tree shakeable providers are just kind of one of the, almost like a baby step in the direction of some of the stuff that is coming, which we'll definitely get into. A lot of people have probably heard about the Ivy renderer, and I'm sure we've mentioned it on the show before, but we got a cool demo about that, and we'll get into that in a little bit as well. But for people that are wondering why that wasn't possible before, if you ever looked at an ng module declaration, and you were always importing all of your providers into that module. And in order to use that, you would then import your module into your application. And there wasn't a way for the tools to know, okay, well, this one is this service was used, but this one wasn't, because a reference to that token would still be there. So it's just with a slight tweak in the syntax, you can actually start making these things so that tools can easily drop them out. You mentioned the CLI, which is actually probably one of the biggest updates coming to Angular in this 6.0 release. First off, being that it's going to start being in the same release cycle as the rest of the library is. So for people that follow Angular, and for people that don't actually, Angular releases all of their libraries at the same time. So there's, the HTTP library, the forums library. When they upgrade Angular to 5.4 or something like that, everything updates to 5.4. So nothing gets out of sync. Up until now, the CLI has been on its own release cycle, and that's one of the things that's coming back into, they're kind of bringing it into that same fold. And that's actually one of the reasons that 6 isn't out yet, is they're putting the finishing touches on the CLI. But enough about just that. I'd really like to go into some of the new cool things that the CLI is going to do, is going to let us do. You mentioned one of them before with Ng Update. Do you want to go a little bit more into even what that is?
Yeah, that's a part of a larger feature called schematics that allow for customizations to the CLI. And obviously there'll be stuff baked into Angular for various pieces, but then also you can write your own custom mechanisms for the CLI. And so when you write a schematic, it can do a number of things. So it can do scaffolding, it can do like linting, that type of thing. And part of the thing is being able to do this update. So where you define before and after rules of from this version to this version, and these are the API changes, and it will detect that you are using the old API version and sort of help you along to update to the new one. And so obviously they're going to use that internally for a lot of the internal API changes. But the really cool thing in addition to that, because schematics is something that allows anyone to create these types of customizations, is that the ultimate goal is for you as a consumer, you as a user building your own application on top of this, that you would not only build your own schematics for your internal standards for how you like to set up your app, if it's not right aligned with the default out of the box standards, but then also you're inevitably going to have your own kind of API changes as you make updates, and you can kind of allow your developers and any consumers that you have to update accordingly as well.
Yeah, I think a good example of where that type of thing shows a lot of use is it was not too long ago that might have been before the material, the Angular 2 material library came out. There was I think the change was just the I think it was just the directive and component names, like the prefix changed from one thing to another, and I don't remember exactly what that is. But in a pre-schematics world, that just had to be documented, and then you would have to go and manually update all this stuff. With something like this, they can actually write stuff that is, you install it and it just updates all of your code to the newest stuff, which is really, really handy. And they've built it in a way that you can do that. So I know at LiveSafe, we have our own internal set of libraries that we use. We can do the same thing. We've got a bunch of different projects. We can write our own schematics if we ever make breaking API changes, like you said, which is a really, really cool thing. One of the other things that's very interesting, the biggest, I guess, surface area change that you might notice about the CLI is that the fact that the config is quite a bit different. One, it's changing from .angular CLI to just angular.json. But one thing that was very interesting, because I've upgraded one thing already, is when you install the latest version of the CLI, which is still in RC, and you update to the latest CLI, it will actually convert your Angular CLI.json file to this new Angular.json file, which again is using one of those schematics. The biggest addition seems to be something that everybody's been clamoring about for a very long time, and that's library generation and library bundling. Can you speak a little bit to that, and perhaps even like why it's been a challenge?
Yeah, it's always been a difficult thing because it's even if so obviously for library authors, but also even internally because like I create like a common set of component pieces that I want to share among multiple teams and that type of thing. So this is like I think a even more prevalent issue than they originally thought. And the question is like, how do you share it? Do you just share your TypeScript files? Do you actually like build the end package and share that, or like, and how do you do it in a way that the consumers get type safety and are able to it doesn't ruin their own ability to package things and pick pieces out that only the ones that they're using. So it's actually a much tougher problem than you would think initially. And so eventually, I forget for version 6 whether this will be right there, and I haven't tried this out myself, but eventually the goal is that the CLI output automatically is set up in such a way that it's easy to share and has kind of everything included. So you kind of get this for free just by using the CLI to compile your project, and then you could just share it out like that. Whereas before you kind of had to jump through various hoops, and even then there's no standard, so everybody was kind of doing it differently, which created some problems.
Yeah. So Angular itself publishes something they call an Angular package format, and it's not something that's specific to Angular in any way, or if it's not bundled, if it's not packaged this way, it won't work. It's pretty much just a document that outlines this is where these different things should go. This is how the package.json should be set up, and this is how the Angular packages themselves are bundled. There is a tool out there called Ng-Packager that is a third party tool that helps handle all of that for you, and that's something that I've been using for quite a while. But with the CLI, it looks like, at least for the moment, they have this wrapper around with the Angular dev kit, that there's a wrapper around Ng-Packager, which will let you configure. So when you are configuring your different projects in the angular.json file, you can say, this one is in the same way that now you can kind of say, this is for the browser or this is for the server. Now you can say, oh, this is for this configuration is a library. And then you will use the Ng-Packager builder to bundle everything up. But it being integrated into the project gives us a couple of a few more interesting things, like it makes certain things easier to. It just makes certain things easier to manage. Obviously, you're in the CLI already, so you don't have to do any strange config to get things like unit tests and stuff like that working correctly. But yeah, like the having library generation. If you've ever looked at the issues in Angular CLI, several of the most commented on ones are about creating libraries. And some of these problems that that you just mentioned, Jeff, are not specific to Angular. They're actually TypeScript challenges. If I have a library written in TypeScript, how do I distribute that? Ng-Pack, and because of the way that Angular's compiler, the current one is built, is it kind of passes through TypeScript. So you can actually use Ng-Packager, and I'm actually guilty of doing this as well, is you can actually just package TypeScript libraries with it as well. They don't have to be Angular. So that, I just think that's also an important point, because Angular is a lot of people's first introduction to TypeScript. Some challenges they may see as just Angular challenges when they're actually just TypeScript challenges in general. So those were. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about upcoming with the CLI?
No, I'm just really excited. I think that the CLI, in my opinion, is a differentiator. in terms of, I know Ember has like a really strong CLI too, so that's probably
Mhm.
the community that's kind of like equivalent. But it's something that the entire community is kind of rallied around, and not everybody. It's not 100% of the community that uses it now, but it is a majority and kind of growing. And I just see bigger and better things because of that in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm right there with you, especially if you look at where it started into where it's at now, and then where it's going to be at 6. It is a very, very cool tool. There's some very smart people that have been working on it. All right, so I'm going to say probably the coolest thing, or at least the highlight for me of Ng-Conf was at the end of the keynote. And at the end of the keynote, they did a demo of something called the Ivy renderer. So that, and I think we've talked about it a little bit on this show before, but I know I've played around with it and looked at some stuff, but this was the first like stage demo I've seen of it, where they were building it live, they were showing actual sizes and that kind of stuff. Tell our listeners a little bit about what Ivy is.
Yeah, sure. So the Angular engine right now is built in such a way that they have this thing called, ahead of time compiling, so that they try to, when you're building your production code, build everything kind of ahead of time so that it doesn't need the compiler at runtime. And that sort of cuts down on the overall package size a little bit and makes things slightly faster and whatever. But the problem is that it's done in such a way that they sort of painted themselves into a wall, because you can't. There's a lot of limitations because of AOT, and I think it is a frustration with the way that it's currently implemented in pre 6 pre-Ivy days, because it's something that you typically will use the runtime compiler at dev time, and then you use the IoT compiler to build your production build. And it can be slightly different, like they do these different customizations, and it's not necessarily equivalent. Because of that, it's not necessarily compatible with things like if you're trying to do server rendering is actually very difficult. And we can get into that later, because of this kind of weirdness that occurs between like the magic that they're doing inside AOT today and versus kind of runtime compiling. And so with the new Ivy engine, I still don't. I have not gotten into look at the low level details, but they're trying to get the best of both worlds, and clearly with their kind of demos, they've been able to show that they've achieved that to some degree, for at least for sample apps, where they still have advanced even further on being able to kind of compile ahead of time and build like an application that doesn't need cuts out all of the unnecessary code from the internal Angular engine ahead of time, and just has an executable that is the minimal possible. But moreover, it's done in such a way that it has an API that you can use at runtime to mimic the same exact thing, and that enables a lot of it makes it so that it's more equivalent between what you're building in dev and production. And if you're doing server rendering versus client rendering, it's much easier to do various things. And I think the biggest benefit of it all is that the end package again is just going to be a lot smaller than even it is today. And so that's sort of a common theme with Angular with every version, is continue to get smaller and smaller, faster and faster, more and more efficient.
Yeah, and so we've said several times that that Ivy makes things smaller and faster. I do want to point out exactly how much smaller. So if you start up the CLI right now, you generate a brand new application and you create a production build from it. Your main bundle is probably going to be around around 41K gzipped. A little bit smaller than that if you're using Brotli compression instead. That's not including, the 12K or whatever for zones. But so that's about what you're going to be. The demo that they showed for a Hello World app using Ivy was around 3K. And I believe that was with Brotli compression. So that is just an example of how much smaller it's going to be. And I meant to point this out when we started talking about Ivy, but Ivy is in 6.0, but it is not on by default and is not necessarily production ready. If you are familiar with the Angular compiler options, if you're using the compiler CLI on its own, there is a flag called Enable Ivy. So that you can start playing around with it now to see the type of stuff that is there. But just to be clear, it is in 6.0, but it is not the default. And I think they've said that they won't make it the default until they are comfortable making it the default for all of the internal applications at Google that use Angular. So still a lot of work to do, but I mean, just from that is an enormous difference.
Yeah, definitely. It's something that, if you think about it, the direction where I think other frameworks are doing something somewhat similar from what I've seen, but the direction is to get to the point where, your runtime should just be as small as your custom code. Like at the end of the day, maybe kind of like a couple other small things that are needed at kind of runtime glue to bring everything together. And a majority of the framework is essentially just a build time tool for you. And that's I think I've seen kind of Emmer taking somewhat of a similar direction as well. And it just makes a lot of sense because you should be able to do a lot of stuff at build time, and it should be kind of up to the developer of just their essential custom code as to how big the app is going to be.
Absolutely. Svelte is a framework that is their explicit goal, where they want the library to the framework should be compiled away. Is one of the things that they say. And yeah, that would kind of be the dream, right? For most things. So a lot of that stuff is very promising, and it's very easy to get very excited about it now, but it's not there yet, but it's coming.
Yep. Definitely.
One other thing that I actually have seen pop up around, especially when they first started showing numbers. So again, it was around 3K for a Hello World app, and then they had a more complete, like a to-do app thing, and it was around 10 or 13 or something like that. So that was using everything. So the other thing about the tree staking stuff is that if you don't use, the idea is that I don't use the ng-if directive, it doesn't include the ng-if directive. So that is the level that it tries to optimize this stuff. But a Hello World was around 3. I think a to-do app using a bunch of different stuff, using dependency injection, using a bunch of different directives. Don't know if it was using content projection or not. It's weighed in around 12 or 13. I will make sure that I put links so that then I promise I'm not just making these numbers up, but I will put links to those. But the thing about it is like, oh, well, if it's gotten that small, what are we losing? Because one of the big things about Angular is kind of the batteries included approach of, all right, here's a thing. You have all the stuff that you need to bring in. From what you can tell, are we losing anything from Angular with Ivy?
I don't think so, because all the libraries are still available. I think that they've never... The philosophy of having kind of all of the core libraries and types of features that you would need in a typical web app available, Angular Material, forms, animations, that's still there. It's just a matter of making it so that behind the scenes, instead of doing, it used to be for doing like really heavy customization or heavy performance work, it would be such time consuming art where you would have to, and there would be limitations because you couldn't, like you were just saying, You couldn't cut out like ngIfs if you weren't using it and that type of thing. But now it's the type of thing where like the framework is enabling you to like freeing you up from that sort of onus of having to do a lot of the. I mean, I have done a lot of this in the past of kind of meticulously going through and trying to like pick out the libraries that aren't being used and trying to like do all these crazy hacks at build time to try to cut down on the size and that type of thing. And it's really painful and annoying. But so I don't think that from a sense of this overall philosophy of all-in-one is still there. It's just a matter of giving you a better ability to optimize what you are using.
Which is fantastic. You mentioned briefly a few minutes ago about how it also helps to simplify things like server-side rendering. So one thing that people actually are probably not familiar with, because the CLI does a good job of taking care of this for you, is even just the way that applications bootstrap at the moment. Pretty much the way you bootstrap something for the runtime compiler versus the AOT compiler are different. The CLI takes care of handling that configuration for you. But that is just one of the examples of the differences currently in AOT versus runtime compilation. You mentioned that this would also make some things with server-side rendering easier, because it's definitely possible now. But in what ways? And you've done a lot of work with Angular server-side rendering. So how does this make that even easier?
Yeah, so there's two big problems with server rendering right now. So it works, and I use it all the time, and plenty of other people do. But the two biggest problems, one is just developer ergonomics. It's a weird. We sort of took a build process and the current AOT kind of the compilation mindset and sort of wedged server rendering in there. So it's you would think, and I know React works this way, that if you're doing the server side rendering, I mean, it's just like running any other node code, right? Like you're just using a library and generating some HTML and returning it, and that's like simple and it's easy to grok, and you can build a lot of stuff off it. The developer ergonomics are a little bit weird because you still have to kind of like create your package like you do with the client side app, even though you shouldn't really have to, because it is a server side app. And then, especially if you're doing kind of pre-rendering, which is like build time generating a bunch of static HTML, you actually have to build two separate packages, and it's very slow. It's not the best, but it works. And once you get it all wired up, like, it's usually fine. But the problem is, as far as that side goes, it has prevented a lot of people from starting to use the Angular server rendering, because you do have to jump through a little bit of these hoops. So with a lot of the Ivy changes, Vikram, who's the head of the universal side of things within Angular now, is starting to plan out a number of changes that will make those kind of ergonomics much more simple, much more like the kind of React server rendering experience from a developer's point of view. And then the other thing is something called hydration. So when you render your server view and then your client takes over, there's a number of ways that can occur. Currently, the way it works in Angular is that Angular will totally re-render the view because there's no ability, because of the kind of intricate way in which the views are generated. They can't be kind of hydration is when, instead of recreating the view, you sort of attach an existing or attach a client-side app to an existing server-side view, so you don't have to recreate it. But that's extremely difficult to do with the current setup, because the client-side app doesn't know how that view got generated. Like, it's hard to recreate it like logically and allow something like that to happen. And so we just like blow it away and re-render the view. And we have a workaround for that called pre-boot that allows you to kind of like buffer it so that you can do it so that there's no like flash or anything like that. So it's not a huge deal. But again, it's one of these things that's not totally ideal, especially if you have server-side ads, they can get messed up. So with Ivy, it allows, because the way in which it's generated is straightforward and recreatable, it opens the possibility of now hydrating on an existing view instead of recreating it. And that's another thing that isn't there yet, but we're trying to shoot for with version 7.
Which would be awesome. Is that one, that seems to be the goal, is that by version 7, because Ivy work is going, sorry, kind of stepped away from my microphone. Ivy work is going to continue, I mean, all the time that 6 is out. And it's entirely possible it might start becoming usable while 6 is out. But 7 seems to be the goal of, okay, Ivy is turned on. This is the way that all things are. Do you get that? Does it feel like that to you as well?
Yeah, I do think that's the goal. Yep.
All right, but yeah, I think that would be great. I actually did not know the part about hydration. That is really that is really cool. Because like I said, because we use server side rendering for Angular stuff now, and it does work after it gets set up. But it is a bit more involved than you pointed to Reacts, which is very easy to is it the method just render to string or something? You just pass it a component and say, I want you to spit out a string, and then we're going to send that back to the browser as HTML, which at the moment doesn't work. There are some things you have to do, but it does work. So that's very, very cool.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited for that, and it will be eventually as easy as that.
Yeah, which is fantastic. So one thing that, how are we doing? We're doing pretty good on time. Another topic I wanted to get into that is not Angular specific, but is very important. And one of I'd say probably the biggest change, I think I said that about the CLI, but the biggest thing, the API surface area to change is actually not Angular itself. It's actually RxJs 6. For those that aren't familiar, RxJS is a peer dependency of Angular itself. So Angular makes use of it in a lot of places. The router is a good example. The reactive forms module is another good example. So it makes a lot of use of observables and RxJS internally. In the latest release of RxJS 6, which is also is not a plan, RxJS is a separate project from Angular. So like when Angular goes up to Angular 6.1 or something, RxJS is not necessarily going to move.
Yeah, it's just total coincidence.
Yeah. It looks like it's on purpose, but it's not. Especially when they were both in RC at the same time. I know right now for NGXS stuff, which is a project that I've been working on. That's one of the things it's hard to get around. It's like, okay, well, which version of like, okay, is this working with Angular 6 and whatever, or with RxJS 6? The big thing there is that just the import syntax is much cleaner. And especially with updates to tools like Webpack, it's much easier to create smaller RxJS bundles as well as smaller Angular bundles. But the tricky thing, and this is what I want to get into, is that everybody is like, I know that we have some apps that we are not going to be able to upgrade to RxJS 6 to the new import syntax all at once. We still have some things that still aren't using pipeable operators yet. So that we still have to go back and update. So they've also introduced these things called RxJS compat, which will allow you to how does that one work? So it is, if you are using a library that relies on RxJS 6, you're going to have RxJS 6 installed. But if you are still using RxJS 5. Whatever, you can install this RxJS compat library, and by some voodoo, everything just starts working again. Have you had any experience upgrading applications from RxJS 5 to 6, and have you had to use the compat library at all?
Yeah, it's funny you bring this up because this entire week, in fact, I have been doing just this. So first of all, let me just say that I am super excited about the new API. Like I've always found the old one difficult. Like I just, God, every time I have to import something, I would be like, okay, what do I have to import? And I have to look up on Stack Overflow and how you do it. So a combination of that, where it's much simpler. There's basically just two different areas you import from, either RxJS or RxJS operators, and so that makes it way better just alone. But then also, like you were starting to allude to, the old API was based off of adding functions to the prototype that, for example, observable, like let's say for switch map or map or whatever, that you would chain them off of the observables, and so you can create this chain of different operators. But the problem with that is that it did make tree shaking harder because, like I mentioned a while ago, when you add something to a prototype, you might not be using it in other areas, but you can't tell. Like the Webpack just can't figure that out. So that was a problem. And there was underneath the scenes, I didn't look at the internals on this, but Ben Lesh, who gave the presentation at Ng-Conf, talked about how because of that setup, it had all this extra code within RxJS that just in order to enable that went away once they went to pure functions. So with pure functions in the new API, it's once you get into it, it is different, but it's like much more simple mental model, in my opinion, because essentially all you do is for cold observables, you just pipe them pretty much all the time, and then add a bunch of operators, comma delimited or comma separated parameters for the pipe function with each successive operator that you want in your chain. And like again, it's slightly different than the current version, which you chain off of previous observables, but it just makes more sense once you start doing it. And so I thought that I would have had to use the compat, like you mentioned, that allows you to still use the prototype way of doing things. But once I started making changes and I sort of understood it, at least this was not the largest app that we have that I did this on. It was a slightly smaller one. So it took me like a day of making some modifications and testing them out and that type of thing. But it wasn't, once I got the hang of it, it wasn't a big deal. So I did actually already migrate one of our smaller apps to RxJS 6 without even the compat, just straight up. And I'm definitely happy.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I'm very happy with it as well. I know one of my coworkers, Sonia, is also ecstatic about not having to import some operator from what was it? It would be RxJS /operators/ whatever the exact one you were going to, because even if you imported from just /operators, your bundle sizes would end up being bigger because Webpack at the Webpack 3 wasn't good enough to get that out of there. But there's a lot of cool stuff coming on that side of things as well. Not just Angular, but some of the things that Angular uses. Those tools themselves are getting quite a bit better.
Oh, one more thing that also I love is that they reduced down, like when you were creating an observable, there used to be like 5 or 6 different functions for doing that, depending whether it's an array or object or whatever. But now it's just of. Just of is like the function, pure function of is used for everything. You pass whatever you want into it, and it turns it into observable. It's awesome.
Yeah, no, it is very, very cool. The whole thing is just talking about developer ergonomics and developer experience is quite a bit better. So we talked about the keynote at Ng-Conf. We talked a lot about Ivy, which is doing some very cool things, and again, to me, it was one of the big highlights. But there were a bunch of other talks that happened at Ng-Conf. NGRX had a ton of really, really good content there on all range of stuff. Some things some stuff that's not just applicable to NGRX, but applicable to I guess just how you go at thinking about state management stuff in general. But I wanted to know, were there any talks that you particularly found fascinating, or something where you learned something you didn't expect, or something like that?
Yeah, there were a couple people who gave talks on Angular Elements, which is the newer API. I don't think it's fully baked yet, but it's allows you.
It's in this release.
It is
Elements is in
okay.
this release. I don't know how ready it is for prime time though.
Yeah, yeah. I got the sense talking to Rob Wormold that he wasn't necessarily suggesting you go full whole hog yet, but that it's getting closer. But anyway, it allows you to author web components, more easily share web components with your app. So like, obviously web component is not Angular specific. It is something, a standard web standard that you can consume any generated web component by other frameworks or other just plain old JavaScript or whatever. And there's just a lot of power there. And so Rob got into a lot of details. There were a couple other. Vikram talked a little bit about a project that he did with Google Shopping app and how they're using Angular elements in a very interesting way. So like I think that area is really exciting, and I feel like something in the future that I think pretty much everybody will be using to some degree.
Yeah, I don't know if at some point I remember talking to Rob at some point and seeing a very early demo of Elements. I don't know if if the goal is eventually that will be the component model of Angular. Angular already integrates really well, and Angular's component model is actually very similar to a custom element, which is part of the web component spec. If you think about in something like React or Preact, everything gets passed in as properties, including callback functions. So, whereas in web component, if you were doing something as a web component, you would have inputs as properties, and then you would emit custom events, which sounds a lot like what Angular is doing. So I don't know if they will eventually be the full standard. But Angular elements are very exciting, but also something that I think also depends on Ivy before it's like 100% ready. It's like, okay, I'm going to start shipping a bunch of things as like with the Angular elements package because of size. If you write a cool little drop-down widget, you want to use it in something else, you want the size of its dependencies to be as small as possible. So it is a very exciting project that everybody should play around with, and anybody that listens to this show should know how much we all like web components, especially custom elements. So that is some very cool stuff. Yeah,
definitely. And then the other thing which I was excited about was somewhat of a self-promotion. So I gave a talk at Ng-Conf as well, and the thing we talked about wasn't as much about a technology, internal Angular technology release, as much as just more of a practical something that one other community member, Nathan Walker, and I have been working on for a while within real world projects that we've been building, which is just best practices for how to use Angular to build stuff that targets multiple platforms at the same time. So it's something that like you can do. Like it's not an innovative in terms of that people weren't doing that before, but it's more so that for the people that are actively building a product that is at the same time on the web and native and maybe even server rendered at the same time, it's difficult. It's difficult of making decisions of like how and where you share code, how your views are split between those different platforms, et cetera. So we did a lot of work over the past 4 months or so, just trying out like a lot of different methods. We pulled in a lot of feedback from the community of what other people are doing as well. And we sort of created what we think is a pretty good set of standards encompassed in a schematic, actually, an extension to the Angular CLI called XPlat, which if you use in your project can give you guidelines and sort of guardrails for how to structure your application in such a way that you can target multiple platforms.
That's very cool. You're all about wanting to run Angular wherever you can.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. So again, checking on time, and we're still doing pretty good. All right. So there was one other tool that I wanted to give a shout out to that had a talk at Ng-Conf, and that was about Stack Blitz. So we had Stack Blitz on the show it actually feels like it's been forever ago, but maybe a month or two ago, talking about a lot of the stuff that they were working on, and a lot of work has happened on StackBlitz since then. Small recap. I'll also put a link in the notes to that episode. A small recap is that StackBlitz is, think of something like a Plunker or CodePen or something like that, but it is built using a lot of the guts of Visual Studio Code, and it is built to make it very easy to build Angular and React applications or any other apps that need tooling. So you can start up an Angular application or a React application. Well, we've been talking about Angular. Start up a React application, do a bunch of code, get your proof of concept, and then actually just download that packet, and then actually just download it. And then you have all of your source code. I know there was something cool with Angular because of the CLI, and everything gets kind of set up the same, that it was actually very easy. There's like, oh, here's a GitHub profile or a GitHub project that's using the Angular CLI. I can actually just open that in StackBlitz. In your opinion, what do tools like StackBlitz give the community that maybe we had actually lost in the world? Like, I love tooling. I like reading about it. I like playing with it, but it has made certain things more difficult. What do tools like StackBlitz give back to the community?
Well, part of the reason why Angular was popular in the first place, back 6 years ago when I started working on it, was that you could just have an HTML document, like literally go straight into that HTML document and just start like putting a little bit of Angular code, like sprinkle a little bit in there, and then be able to do magic. And that was, I mean, over time, that some of that was looked at as a negative because you could kind of like just put spaghetti code in there and people would build entire apps off of trying to do this. But in terms of just getting people started, that was a really great thing. And it was a magical experience for a lot of people in those days. And we lost that, right? Because now it's so heavy. You have to go through this, build process, learn about Webpack, learn about all the other tooling involved, TypeScript, everything else. And so, you don't, it's hard to set up an example for a new person. And that's the key thing. Well, I mean, I think everybody appreciates it, but especially for people who are new that are just coming into it, to just get something working. That's the thing, is that when you can have a new person that actually the fastest time to where they see something working and it clicks, that is going to enable them to, or encourage them to use it more and to kind of build on top of it and eventually become like a strong community member and a strong user of whatever technology it is. So for Angular, and I obviously StackBlitz, like you said, does other things, but for Angular in particular, I think it is so amazing because you don't have to worry about any of that. You almost go back to those 2012 days that just go and make some changes and then see it happen. In fact, I during Ng-Conf, I had my wife who's just learning to code and my kids, 5 and 7 years old, who are part of Ng-Kids, an awesome program that one of the many reasons why Ng-Conf is awesome. They run this program for kids to teach them how to code and everything. And for most of the time, when they were teaching them how to code, they used a version, I forget what it was called, but something like Scratch. But I showed them StackBlitz one night after they had been playing around with some other stuff, and had them change some stuff. And it didn't take them long before, like 7 years old. And my daughter was essentially coding some stuff in Angular, making changes and seeing the results right away. And honestly, that would not occur without StackBlitz. If you had to get her to do something kind of at the command line in her own project or whatever, it just wouldn't happen. So I am really, really excited about that project and sort of the future potential there.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's fantastic. They've also, I know their big things are getting up and running with frameworks. So you can also just get started with the vanilla JavaScript projects, vanilla TypeScript projects, excuse me, other things like that too. So it is very, very cool. Well, all right, Jeff, it looks like we are starting to run out of time. So first off, are there any parting words about Ng-Conf or anything else you wanted to give a shout out to before we sign off?
Well, the last thing I would just say that we didn't talk about is just the community, the Angular community, and every time we, at Ng-Conf and similar events, we of course talk about a lot of technology and new stuff that's being built and that type of thing. But it's also a time for the community to get together and kind of coordinate a lot of activities and people help each other out. And I'm reminded once again of how great the Angular community itself is. There were a number of, in addition to just kind of like everybody talking and helping each other out in different ways, there were a number of specific initiatives during this conference, like NG Girls, like the NG Diversity, a couple of different things of the community kind of working just to make each other better, like regardless of what the technology is. Just like there is this sort of almost thing that comes, I believe, from the top down, from the people who created and maintain Angular, Igor, Manar, and Misko and Brad. These ideals about helping each other out, about bringing people together, inclusivity. And so you see a lot of that on display during the conference, and it sort of invigorates everyone. It's really great.
Yeah, I totally agree. The Angular community is fantastic. So I did want to bring up one other thing. It has nothing to do with Angular, but it does have something to do. It kind of ties into what you were talking about teaching kids how to get into some of this stuff. I don't have any kids, but my wife loves me and bought me Nintendo's Project Labo, which if you're not familiar with it, it works with the Switch, but it's cardboard. So it's a big flat pack box of cardboard. And it gives you instructions on how to build these interactive toys. So I built a little cardboard piano, actually, with moving keys. There's no glue required, no tape required. And it works. You sit the Switch on top of it and you play this little cardboard keyboard. While all of that is fun, and it was fun to put together, I'm going to put it on display somewhere. It has a section where it teaches you, but also speaks directly to kids about how this thing works. And they encourage you to kind of hack around with it and figure out, well, okay, so you know that now it uses this little IR camera and some reflective tape. What other cool things can you think of to start making it work? Can you make the piano control one of the other Labo kits or something like that? So I just want to give a quick shout out to that. If you have kids, I would definitely look into it. If you don't have kids, I would also still look into it. So Jeff, we've talked a lot about Angular, the community, like you said, which we absolutely should need to bring up. Some of the really cool stuff coming in Ivy that's coming in 7, the really cool stuff coming in Angular 6. If I'm sure people listening are going to have more questions. If anybody had questions or wanted to get in touch with you, what is the best way?
Yes, the best way is Twitter for me. I'm on there all the time. I love talking with everybody and responding, and we can kind of go from there. So it's at Jeff Whelpley, and I'd love to hear from you.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you very much for coming on and spending some time with us and with our listeners. Justin had to run, but no worries. I am still here. And this has been episode 160 of the Web Platform Podcast, and we will talk to everybody next week.
See you later.